The fact that you are hearing this means the frequencies are still clear, at least for now. If you are new to this channel, keep your volume low and your lights lower. My name is Anel Hartnell. Before the silence settled over the frequency bands, before the world contracted down to the radius of a rifle scope, life in our corner of the Olympic Peninsula ran on a tight, hydraulic loop of structural retrofits, wet lumber, and the endless, driving rain of the Pacific Northwest. Structural contracting paid the steady bills. Specialized seismic upgrades paid for the extras. And when a project signed off clean, Greer and I could vanish for 2 nights and come back feeling like human beings again. Greer Hartnell is a forensic accountant, the kind of woman who treats a spreadsheet like a crime scene. She is calm, practical, and she spots trouble while it is still a faint vibration in the floorboards 3 miles down the road. She watched me sketching one night, her eyes tracing the load paths on the blueprints, and told me, "If you're building something for us, Anel, make sure it holds up when the sheer strength of the world fails." I listened. 40 minutes outside of town, past the last sodium vapor streetlight and where the county pavement disintegrates into a slurry of gravel and clay, sits our property. It is not a cabin. It's a decommissioned fire lookout tower. A 60-foot steel skeleton rooted into a granite ridge, crowned with a glass-walled command deck that I spent 3 years turning into a fortress. It was never meant to be a bunker. It was strictly meant to be a weekend reset button, a place where the cellular signal died and the wind through the Douglas firs was loud enough to drown out the friction of the work week. Construction finished months before the supply chains snapped. And then the autumn came in hard, a relentless atmospheric river that stalled over the coast, and the rain simply never stopped. Up on the catwalk, the wind does not blow. It pushes. It exerts a physical weight against you. I was up there on a Tuesday, 3 days before the collapse, tightening the tension rods on the northeast face. The structure is a galvanized steel truss system, built in the 50s, but steel fatigues. I had my wrench on a 7/8-inch bolt, applying torque until my knuckles turned white. The metal was cold enough to burn through my gloves. When a gust hit the ridge, the entire tower shifted. It was not a wobble. It was a calculated flex. The steel groaned, a deep, resonant complaint that vibrated through the soles of my boots and settled in my teeth. That is the sound of safety. Rigid things break. Flexible things survive. I gave the nut one final quarter turn, feeling the threads bite and lock, securing the cross brace against the coming winter. Back in town, the small things started to shear off first. It was not an explosion. It was the slow, grinding friction of a system running without oil. I was at the supply yard in Aberdeen, picking up a crate of heavy-duty lag screws. The air in the warehouse smelled of wet cardboard and sawdust. The forklift driver, a man named Miller I'd known for a decade, was not moving with his usual efficiency. He dropped the pallet on the loading dock with a jarring impact that shook the concrete. "Supply chain's pinched, Anel," Miller said, wiping grease from his forehead. He did not meet my eyes. "Vendor says the resin plants in Texas are offline. No resin, no glue. No glue, no plywood. I can give you the screws, but I can't promise the lumber for the framing job." I looked at the shelves behind him. They were usually stacked to the ceiling with yellow pine and treated fir. Now, the racks showed gap-toothed spaces, dark voids where the inventory used to be. The silence in the warehouse was wrong. Usually there was the high-pitched whine of saws, the beep of reversing trucks, the shouting of foremen. Today, it was just the hum of the high bay lights and the sound of rain hammering the corrugated metal roof. "It's just a hiccup," I said, testing the weight of the box. Miller looked at the loading bay door, staring at the gray curtain of rain. My brother works logistics at the port of Tacoma. He says the containers are not moving. The cranes are stopped. He says the crews are calling in sick, but not with the flu. That was the first tremor. By mid-October, the rain was a constant, oppressive presence, a gray sheet that erased the horizon. In a town that usually talks about nothing but timber quotas and high school football, the weather should have been the headline. But the atmosphere had shifted. People moved through the grocery store aisles with a tight, erratic energy. They did not make eye contact. They acted like they were navigating a room full of mousetraps. The cashier, Brenda, stopped scanning my items and leaned over the belt. Her hands were trembling, the laser scanner dancing across a bag of coffee beans. "You hear about the hospital in Olympia?" she whispered. I asked what she meant, assuming it was a strike or a budget cut. "Full," she said, the word coming out as a harsh exhale. "My cousin is a triage nurse. She says they locked the doors from the outside, Anel. They are not letting ambulances in anymore." Before I could press her, the conveyor belt motor engaged with a mechanical lurch, and she snapped back to a plastic, terrified smile. Greer did not smile at any of it. She sat at our kitchen island, the glow of her laptop reflecting in her glasses, analyzing the data streams that were still trickling through. "The county health numbers are delayed by 48 hours, she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of panic. The voice she used when a client's tax return revealed embezzlement. "That does not happen unless someone is manually scrubbing the data. They are buying time to figure out a narrative." The TV news stayed soft and careful, using phrases like isolated incidents and civil unrest. But the reality was visible in the streets. The social contract was dissolving. I watched a man in the hardware aisle snap at a teenager just for clearing his throat, barking at the kid to back off. The kid did not argue. He abandoned his cart and walked out, his boots squeaking on the linoleum. Then came the night the network died. It happened at 9:17 p.m. We were in the living room, listening to the wind batter the siding of our suburban house. The silence was broken by a discordant, piercing shriek from our phones, the emergency alert system. The sound was a jagged, electronic tear in the room's atmosphere. The screen read, "Curfew effective immediately. Avoid contact with aggressive persons. Shelter in place." Then the signal cut. No static, no fade. Just a sudden, absolute zero. The icon on the phone screen spun for a moment and then froze. Greer looked at me, her face pale in the screen light. She closed her laptop with a decisive snap. "We leave at first light." The treehouse stopped being a weekend project. It became the only variable we could control. We did not sleep. The night was spent in a tactical fugue state. Greer moved through the house with a checklist, turning the kitchen island into a staging ground. We were not packing for a vacation. We were packing for a siege. "Calories matter," she said, sliding cans of tuna and chili into a heavy-duty tote. "But morale matters just as much. Salt, coffee, honey. If we are cold and wet, sugar is the difference between functioning and shutting down." I focused on the hardware. The tower was 40 minutes out, up a logging road that washed out if you looked at it wrong. I went to the garage, the air smelling of gasoline and cold concrete. My truck, a 3/4-ton diesel, sat waiting. I did not just throw gear in the bed. I engineered the load. Heavy items went forward of the rear axle to keep the center of gravity low. The generator, a portable Honda unit, went in first, strapped down with ratchet straps that groaned as I cranked them tight. Then the fuel. 2 5-gallon jerry cans of diesel, red plastic gleaming under the garage lights. I checked the seals on the caps, tightening them until the plastic deformed slightly, ensuring no fumes would escape. Tools were the line between being a refugee and being a resident. I packed a pry bar, a roll of thick 6mm plastic sheeting, and my primary tool bag. I made sure to grab the cordless impact driver and every spare lithium battery I owned.
I knew the tower had a wood stove, but I also grabbed a backup propane heater and 3 tanks. Greer appeared in the doorway, holding a locked hard case. "I cleared the safe," she said. I nodded. We did not talk about the guns, but we packed them. A pump-action shotgun, unloaded, action open. A handgun in a locked box. In a world where the law had just evaporated, ballistics were simply another form of physics. Morning came gray and wet. The rain was drumming in the gutters, a rhythmic, hollow sound that masked the silence of the neighborhood. We rolled out just after sunrise. The streets were eerie. A neighbor stood on his porch, staring at his phone, tapping the screen aggressively as if he could force the signal to return. He looked up as we passed, his face slack with confusion. We did not stop. Greer stared straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap. "Do not stop," she said. "Not for anyone." The route to the tower is a winding artery through the timberlands. Once the pavement gave way to the county gravel, the tension shifted from social to mechanical. The road was dissolving. Runoff had carved deep channels across the track, turning the gravel into a brown slurry. I kept the truck in 4 high, letting the torque pull us through the slick spots. The tires hissed as they cut through the mud, slinging clay into the wheel wells with a sound like wet rags hitting a wall. The suspension worked hard, the shocks compressing and rebounding as we navigated the ruts. "River Road is gone," I said, watching the brown water of the creek rising near the shoulder. "If the bridge at mile 4 is out, we're hiking." "It'll hold," Greer said, though she was gripping the door handle. We passed a sedan abandoned in the ditch. The driver's door hung open, swinging slightly in the wind. The interior light was dead. There was no one around it, just the rain falling into the open cabin, soaking the upholstery. "Keep moving," Greer whispered. The turnoff for our property is marked only by a rusted reflector on a cedar stump. I swung the truck onto the access road, the engine growling as the incline steepened. This was the final ascent. The road here is not maintained by the county. It's maintained by me. It's a series of switchbacks cut into the side of the ridge, narrowed by encroaching salal and blackberry brambles that scraped against the truck's paint with a high-pitched screech. We reached the base of the tower at 800. The clearing was empty. The structure loomed above us, disappearing into the low-hanging clouds. The steel legs were black against the gray sky, crisscrossed with tension cables. The glass cube at the top was invisible, shrouded in mist. I killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy. No birds, no distant highway drone. Just the wind hissing through the pine needles, and the metallic tink, tink, tink of the truck's exhaust cooling down. Greer opened her door and stepped into the mud. She looked up at the tower, then at the heavy steel gate that blocked the stairs. "It looks intact. Let's get the perimeter secured before we haul," I said. I walked to the base of the tower. The concrete footings were solid, buried deep in the granite. I checked the turnbuckles on the guy wires. They were tight, humming like guitar strings in the wind. The gate at the bottom of the stairs was a heavy mesh weldment I'd fabricated myself. I unlocked the padlock, a high-security shackle that operated with a smooth, heavy resistance, and swung the gate open. The hinges complained with a dry squeal I needed to grease. We climbed. 60 feet of galvanized grating. The wind picked up as we rose above the tree line, pulling at our clothes.
The rain here did not fall down. It flew sideways, stinging my face. Reaching the catwalk, I grabbed the railing. The deck was slick. I unlocked the heavy steel door to the cabin. The seal broke with a sucking sound, the pressure equalizing. We stepped inside. The difference was instant. The wind noise dropped to a dull roar. The air inside was cold, stagnant, and smelled of pine and cold steel. The glass walls offered a 360-degree view of the apocalypse, but right now, all they showed was a wall of white fog.
Greer dropped her pack on the floorboards. She did not relax. She immediately walked to the solar charge controller on the wall. The display was dark.
"Batteries are flat," she said. "The panels have not seen sun in weeks." "I'll fire up the generator at the base," I said. "We can run the line up." "No," she said, turning to look at me. "Noise discipline. If we run a generator, everyone in the valley hears it. We use the stove. We use the propane. We stay dark." She was right. The tower was a fortress, but it was also a beacon. I knelt by the wood stove, a cast-iron jodel unit bolted to the floor in the center of the room. It was cold to the touch, a block of freezing metal. I opened the door and began to build a fire, my hands moving with practiced memory. Crumpled paper, small kindling, dry fire. I struck a match. The sulfur flared, a sharp, biting smell. The paper caught. The draft drew the flame upward into the chimney pipe with a low, throaty roar. I fed it larger pieces, listening to the wood pop and crackle. Heat began to radiate outward, pushing back the damp chill. The glass walls began to fog up as the temperature differential hit them. "We need to get the supplies up before the weather turns worse," I said, standing up. "It's already worse," Greer said, pointing to the glass. Outside, the fog was lifting just enough to see the tree line below.
And there, near the truck, I saw the first sign that we were not alone in the woods. A shape was moving near the bumper of my truck. It was not an animal. It was a man, wearing a soaked windbreaker. He was not looking at the truck. He was bumping into it. He walked into the tailgate, rebounded, and walked into it again. A mindless, repetitive collision. I grabbed the binoculars from the sill and brought them to my eyes. The magnification clarified the image. The man's face was slack, his jaw hanging open at an unnatural angle. His skin was the color of wet newsprint. "He's not looting," I said, handing the glasses to Greer. "He does not know the truck is there." Greer looked for a long moment, then lowered the glasses. Her face was set in stone. "Lock the hatch, Janelle, and pull the curtains. We just disappeared." I went to the door, engaged the deadbolt, and dropped the heavy blackout shades. The room went dim, lit only by the orange flicker of the wood stove. The wind howled outside, a constant physical pressure against the glass, trying to find a way in. We were anchored, but the storm was just beginning. The laws of thermodynamics do not care about the collapse of civilization. Heat moves to cold. Moisture condenses on cool surfaces. And a glass box suspended 60 feet in the air, amidst a freezing coastal rainforest, is essentially a machine designed to kill you with hypothermia if you do not actively manage its physics. Inside the lookout, the wood stove was roaring, a cast-iron heart pumping heat into the room. But the single-pane safety glass of the original 1950s design, even with the storm films I'd applied, was acting as a massive thermal bridge. The warm air from the stove hit the freezing glass, and the moisture in the air, amplified by our breath and damp clothes, was turning into liquid water instantly. I stood by the south wall, watching a rivulet of condensation track down the pane. It pooled on the steel sill, threatening to drip into the subfloor insulation.
If the insulation got wet, it would lose its R value. If it lost its R value, the room would never hold heat, no matter how much wood we burned. "We have to manage the humidity," I said, running a rag along the metal sill. The cloth came away heavy and cold. "If we do not, we'll be fighting mold in 3 days and pneumonia in a week." Greer was sitting on the floor by the tactical tote, organizing the calorie intake for the next 24 hours. She did not look up, but her hands stopped moving. "Ventilation? We lose heat if I crack the vents," I replied, "but we lose the structure if I do not." I moved to the ceiling vents.
They were manual crank operators, heavy brass gears connected to a worm drive. I gripped the cold handle and turned it. The mechanism offered stiff resistance, the grease inside the casing thickened by the cold, before the gears engaged with a sensation of grinding metal. The upper transom window tilted open 2 inches. Immediately, a draft of freezing, wet air cut through the rising heat of the stove. It was a physical assault, a knife of cold air slicing through the warmth. But it was necessary. We needed the convection current to carry the moisture out. "How's the fuel situation?" I asked, wiping my hands on my work pants. Greer looked at the stack of dry fire I'd brought up in the initial hall. "We have enough for 6 hours of high burn, maybe 10 if we choke it down and accept the cold. The rest is in the truck." The truck. I walked to the blackout shade and peeled back the edge, just enough to create a slit of visibility. The fog was swirling around the steel legs of the tower, a gray turbulence that obscured the ground. Through the gaps in the mist, I could see the dark shape of my Dodge Ram. The figure was still there. It was a man in a yellow rain slicker now, or at least he had been a man. He was standing near the tailgate, swaying with a drunken, irregular rhythm. He was not attacking the vehicle. He was simply existing near it, occasionally bumping his shoulder against the taillight assembly. The motion was repetitive, a mechanical loop of motor dysfunction. "He's blocking the drop zone," I said. "And the jerry cans are strapped in the bed. I cannot haul them up if he's standing right there." "Is he alone?" Greer asked. "I cannot see past the tree line. The fog is too thick." We needed those cans. Diesel for the emergency heater, gasoline for the chainsaw if a tree fell across the access road, and water. The truck bed held 2 5-gallon Scepter water cans, filled from the municipal supply before the pressure died. That was 80 pounds of water. Carrying that up 6 flights of open great steel stairs in the rain was a recipe for a slip and fall disaster. "I need to rig the hoist," I said. "We lift the heavy stuff over the rail. I'm not carrying 80-pound jugs up the stairs while dodging a walker." I went to the equipment locker, a steel job box bolted to the floor in the corner. I unlocked the heavy padlocks and threw the lid back. The smell of oil and canvas rose up. Inside lay my rigging gear, coils of static climbing rope, webbing slings, steel carabiners, and a heavy-duty double-sheave pulley block. I pulled out a 100-foot coil of 11mm static line. It was stiff, the nylon fibers tight and unforgiving. I grabbed 2 locking carabiners and a length of tubular webbing. "I'm going out to the catwalk," I told Greer. "Lock the door behind me. Do not open it unless you hear my knock pattern." She nodded, already moving to the door to secure the deadbolt the moment I stepped through. I stepped out into the violence. The transition was shocking. Inside, the air was still and warm. Outside, the wind hit me with the force of a physical blow, stripping the heat from my layers instantly. The rain was horizontal, driven by a gust that screamed through the steel trusswork of the tower. I clipped my safety tether to the railing before I even took a step. The catwalk was galvanized steel grating, designed to let snow fall through,
but right now it was coated in a thin, treacherous layer of ice and pine needles. I moved to the southwest corner of the deck, directly above the truck. The wind buffeted the tower, and I felt the entire structure sway, a slow, sickening lurch of several inches. I planted my boots wide, trusting the friction of the Vibram soles against the icy metal. I wrapped the tubular webbing around the main structural beam of the roof overhang, tying a water knot. I dressed the knot carefully, pulling each strand tight to ensure it would not slip under load. A sloppy knot is a failure point. I clipped the pulley into the webbing loop. The steel snap of the gate closing was lost in the wind, but I felt the vibration in my glove. I threaded the rope through the pulley, feeding it down into the gray void. The weight of the rope dragged it down, uncoiling from the deck like a dying snake.
I watched the end of the rope disappear into the fog.
It should land about 10 feet from the truck's tailgate. Now came the hard part. I had to go down there. I tapped the knock pattern on the glass, 2 fast, 1 slow. Greer unlocked the door, and I slipped back inside, shivering violently. "Rigged?" she asked. "Rigged. I'm going down to load the sling. You need to be on the haul line. It's a 1-to-1 pull, so you're lifting the full weight, but I'll be pushing from the bottom until it clears the truck." "I can pull it," she said. She was not big, but she practiced functional fitness with a terrifying discipline. "Just make sure the load is balanced." I checked my belt, a hammer in the loop, a pry bar. No gun. A gunshot would echo off the valley walls and draw every dead thing in a 5-mile radius. This had to be silent. I opened the hatch in the floor that led to the internal ladder for the first 10 feet, bypassing the exposed upper stairs. I climbed down into the cold underbelly of the tower. The wind here was louder, whistling through the steel girders. I descended the main stairs slowly. The metal steps rang with a hollow, metallic note if I moved too fast, so I placed my feet with deliberate precision, rolling from the outside edge of the boot to the sole, absorbing the impact. My eyes stayed locked on the ground below. As I descended past the 30-foot mark, the fog thinned slightly.
The man in the yellow slicker was clearer now. He was facing away from the stairs, his forehead resting against the tailgate of my truck. He looked like a drunk, trying to remember where he left his keys. But the stillness was wrong. He was not shivering. He was not shifting his weight to stay warm. He was just paused. I reached the bottom landing. The gate was 10 feet away. I unlatched it, moving the bolt slowly to avoid the squeal of metal on metal. It slid back with a gritty friction. I stepped onto the wet gravel. The mud was deep here, a slurry of clay and pine needles. It sucked at my boots. I needed to distract him. I could not risk a wrestle in the mud. A scratch meant infection, and infection meant death in a world without antibiotics. I picked up a rock the size of a baseball, heavy and wet. I looked at the woods to the east, away from the truck. I hurled the rock into the brush. It landed with a wet, heavy crash, breaking a dry branch. The man in the slicker reacted instantly. His head snapped up, the vertebrae cracking audibly. He turned toward the sound, not with curiosity, but with a sudden, jerky, predatory focus. He let out a low, wet noise, not a moan, but the sound of air escaping a fluid-filled lung. He shuffled toward the brush, his movements stiff but relentless. He walked right past me, 10 feet away. I held my breath, pressing myself against the cold steel of the tower leg. The smell hit me as he passed, a thick, a sweet odor of rot and stagnant water. He did not look up. His sensory input was locked onto the sound in the bushes. As soon as he vanished into the fog, I moved. I sprinted to the truck bed, keeping my weight on the balls of my feet to minimize the squelch of the mud.
I vaulted onto the tailgate. The suspension creaked, a low groan that sounded like a gunshot to my ears. I froze, waiting. Nothing came from the woods. I grabbed the end of the rope dangling from the tower. I worked fast, my fingers stiff with cold. I tied a bowline knot around the handle of the first water jug, then looped a safety line through the second handle. I signaled up to the glass cube, waving my arm in a wide arc. The rope went taut. The slack disappeared, snapping tight with a vibration that hummed in the air. The jugs lifted off the truck bed, swinging slightly. "Haul," I whispered, though she could not hear me. The jugs rose. I watched them ascend, spinning slowly in the wind. 10 feet. 20. They disappeared into the mist. I waited, scanning the tree line, my hand gripping the cold steel of the pry bar. Minutes passed. The rope came back down, the empty loop dancing in the wind. I loaded the 2 diesel cans next, then the crate of canned goods. On the final load, the propane tank, I heard the sound of footsteps returning.
Not the slow shuffle of the yellow slicker, but the squelching, sucking sound of something pulling itself out of the mud. I looked toward the ditch. Another one. This one was wearing a torn flannel shirt, its arm hanging at a wrong angle, swinging loosely like a pendulum. It was looking directly at me. I clipped the propane tank to the rope and gave the signal. The tank rose. The flannel shirt figure let out a snarl, a dry, rasping sound, and broke into a stumbling run toward the truck. I did not have time to climb the stairs. I scrambled onto the roof of the truck cab. The metal was slick with rain. I slid, my boots scrambling for purchase on the wet paint, before I caught the roof rack. I pulled myself up just as the figure slammed into the driver's side door. The impact shook the vehicle. The figure clawed at the window glass, its fingernails screeching against the pane, a sound that made my teeth ache. I looked up. The propane tank was halfway up the tower. I could not leave the truck roof until the figure lost interest. I laid flat on the roof rack, making myself invisible from the ground. I watched the gray sky, feeling the rain soak through my canvas jacket. Below me, the thing kept scratching at the glass, a rhythmic, mindless attempt to get inside a space it could not reach. After 10 minutes, the scratching stopped. The figure lost focus. I heard it shuffle away, drifting toward the base of the tower where the gate stood open. Shit. If it went through the gate, it would block my exit. I crawled to the edge of the roof and looked down. It was standing right in the gateway, staring at the stairs. I needed a distraction. I reached into my pocket and found my multi-tool. It was not heavy enough to make a noise. I looked at the truck bed. There was a loose piece of scrap lumber, a 2x4 cutoff. I grabbed it and threw it as hard as I could toward the woods on the opposite side. It hit a tree trunk with a solid, wooden thwack. The figure turned and shambled toward the noise. I dropped from the roof, landing in the mud with a heavy splatter. I did not look back. I sprinted for the gate, slipped through, and locked it behind me. The padlock clicked shut, a final, definitive sound. I climbed the 60 feet of stairs 2 at a time, my lungs burning, the adrenaline dumping into my system, making my hands shake. When I reached the top, Greer opened the door. I stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floorboards. The room was full of supplies, the water jugs, the fuel, the food. "Clear?" she asked, locking the door. "Clear," I gasped. "But the gate is compromised. They know the stairs are there now." Greer looked at the supplies. "We have the water. We have the fuel. We can weld the gate shut if we have to." I sat up, stripping off my soaked jacket. The warmth of the stove hit me, but the chill was deep in my bones. "We need to filter that water," The municipal stuff has been sitting in plastic for 2 months. It'll be full of microplastics, and maybe worse.
The next hour was spent on the systems. Survival is not about fighting. It's about maintenance. I set up the filtration station on the kitchen counter. We used a gravity-fed Berkey system I'd bought 3 years ago. The stainless steel chambers were cold. I poured the water from the Scepter jerry cans into the top chamber. It smelled of chlorine and stagnation. I watched it drip through the black carbon elements. Drip, drip, drip. It was agonizingly slow. The physics of filtration cannot be rushed. The water has to be forced through microscopic pores to strip out the bacteria and the cysts. While the water filtered, I turned my attention to the power. The batteries were dead, which meant no lights, no charging the radio. I'm going to bring the solar controller offline and wire the batteries in parallel, I said, opening the electrical panel on the wall. If I can balance the load, we might squeeze enough juice out of the residuals to run the LED strip for an hour. I worked with a multimeter and a small screwdriver. The wires were color-coded, but in the dim light of the stove, red and black looked like shades of gray. I used the continuity tester to check the circuits. The needle on the meter barely moved.
The bank is drained, I said. Deep discharge. If we do not get sun tomorrow, these batteries might chemically degrade to the point of no return.
We have the generator, Greer said. Too loud. Not if we bury it. I looked at her. Bury it? Dig a pit at the base, she said, her voice practical. Line it with plywood and foam. Vent it with a pipe. It'll muffle the sound. It's a risk, but living in the dark is a bigger risk. We need to charge the perimeter sensors if we want to sleep. She was right. I had not installed the sensors yet. Infrared tripwires I'd packed in the tote, but without power, they were useless bricks. Tomorrow, I said. We dig tomorrow. The evening settled in. The fog turned into a total blackout. The world outside the glass simply ceased to exist, replaced by a wall of obsidian darkness. The only sound was the wind, a constant, mournful pressure against the tower, and the rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum of the rain against the metal roof. I sat by the stove, sharpening my knife on a whetstone. The sound of the steel grinding against the stone was soothing, a repetitive, abrasive friction that focused the mind. Greer was heating a can of chili on the top of the stove. The smell of cumin and processed meat filled the small glass cube. It was the best thing I had ever smelled. We have water, Greer said, staring at the fire. We have heat. We have food for 2 weeks.
And we have neighbors, I added. She looked at the blackout shade. Do you think they can smell the food? The wind is blowing away from the ridge, I said. We're upwind. But if the wind shifts... I did not finish the sentence. We both knew the answer. The tower was a chimney. It pushed scent plumes out into the world. I stood up and went to the glass. I pressed my hand against the cold surface. I could not see anything, but I could feel the vibration of the structure. The steel was alive, reacting to the energy of the storm. Now, Greer said softly. I turned. The drip, she said, pointing to the ceiling corner. I looked up. A dark stain was spreading on the pine paneling in the northeast corner. A single drop of water formed, heavy and glistening in the firelight, and fell. It hit the floor with a wet splat. The roof seal had failed. Get the bucket, I said, grabbing the ladder. It started with 1 drop, but as I climbed up to inspect the leak, I could hear the water pooling above the ceiling panels. The wind had driven the rain under the flashing. This was not just a leak. It was an intrusion. The systems were holding, but the fortress was starting to bleed. I jammed a screwdriver into the panel seam, prying it open.
A gush of cold water poured out, soaking my arm. It smelled of wet insulation and rust. "We have a breach!" I yelled, struggling to keep the panel from collapsing.
Greer was already there with the bucket and a roll of duct tape. We were fighting the storm from the inside now, and the night had only just begun. Water is patient, but gravity is relentless. The leak in the northeast corner was not just a drip, it was a breach of the building envelope. The wind, accelerating over the ridgeline and hitting the tower at 60 miles per hour, was driving the rain horizontally. It had found a seam in the flashing, a millimeter of separation where the galvanized steel cap met the roof membrane, and forced its way under. Now, gravity was pulling it down through the insulation, soaking the fiberglass batting and pooling on the back side of the tongue and groove pine ceiling. I watched the wood darken. It started as a stain the size of a coin, then bloomed outward into the shape of a dinner plate. The water found the path of least resistance, tracking along the seam of the boards until it reached the edge of the wall. Then it began to fall. It hit the floorboards with a heavy, wet rhythm. Impact, impact, impact. Each drop was a failure of the system I had spent 3 years designing. "It's not stopping," Greer said. She was already moving, shoving the sleeping pads away from the wet zone. "The wind is forcing it in." I grabbed the plastic sheeting from the supply tote, the 6mm vapor barrier I'd packed for exactly this kind of structural failure. "We can't plug it from the inside." The water is already behind the vapor barrier. If we trap it, we rot the roof joists.
"So we divert it," she said, finishing my thought.
We worked in a tight, desperate tandem. I unfolded the thick plastic, the material crinkling stiffly in the cold air. I climbed the stepladder, my boots slipping slightly on the wet floor. I used a staple gun to anchor the plastic to the ceiling, creating a wide, flared catchment area around the leak. The spring of the staple gun fired, driving the steel wire into the wood with a sharp, mechanical snap that vibrated through my hand. I draped the plastic down, twisting the bottom into a funnel shape, and directed it into the 5-gallon bucket we'd used for hauling. The sound changed. Instead of the wet slap of water on wood, it became the hollow, drumming rattle of water hitting tight plastic. It was louder, but it was controlled. "That buys us time," I said, stepping down. I wiped my face. My skin felt tight and cold. "But it's a Band-Aid. If the wind rips that flashing loose, the whole corner of the roof comes up. The uplift force on a flat roof in a gale is tremendous. It acts like a wing." Greer looked at the ceiling, then at the black void of the window. "You can't go up there now. The wind chill is below freezing. The deck will be covered in ice." "If the roof peels," I said, my voice flat, "the pressure differential blows the windows out." "Then we do not have a shelter. We have a wind tunnel." I walked to the tool chest. I did not want to go out there. Every instinct in my reptilian brain was screaming to stay near the stove, to curl up and wait for the morning. But engineering does not care about fear. It only cares about load paths and fasteners. I stripped off my canvas work jacket and put on my heavy rain shell, a rubberized commercial fishing coat that was stiff and smelled of PVC. I put on my fall protection harness, stepping into the leg loops and tightening the buckles until they dug into my thighs. I checked the dorsal ring, feeling for the cold steel D-ring between my shoulder blades. "I need the roofing cement," I said, "the wet patch stuff, and the impact driver with the hex head bits." Greer handed me the tube of sealant and the caulk gun. She checked the battery on the drill. "Full charge. Keep it inside your jacket until you need it. The cold will drain the lithium." She grabbed the end of my safety line, the 11mm static rope we'd used for the hoist. "I'm belaying you from the stove anchor.
If you slide, I lock it off. Do not lock it too fast, I warned. The shock load will break ribs. I clipped the rope to my chest harness. I clipped a second, shorter lanyard to my belt, a positioning cowtail with a large rebar hook. I stuffed my pockets with gasketed roofing screws, feeling their sharp points through my gloves. Radio check, Greer said.
We did not have radios, but she meant the protocol. 3 knocks on the roof means I'm coming down. Constant pounding means I'm stuck. I nodded. I pulled my hood up and cinched it tight. I unlocked the door. The pressure difference made the latch fight me. I had to lean my shoulder into the steel to compress the weather stripping. I shoved the door open. The night screamed. It was not just wind. It was a physical assault. The air was moving so fast it felt solid, a wall of turbulence that slammed against me, trying to throw me back into the room. The rain was not falling. It was firing horizontally like buckshot, stinging any exposed skin. I stepped out onto the catwalk and slammed the door. I heard the deadbolt slide home behind me. I was locked out. The world was chaos. The catwalk was vibrating, a high-frequency shudder that traveled up through my boots. The steel grating was coated in a thin glaze of verglas, clear, hard ice. My first step slipped, my boot skating across the metal before the heel caught a crossbar. I clipped my positioning lanyard to the railing. Click. Safety 1. I moved crabwise toward the ladder on the north face. The wind was coming from the southwest, hitting the corner of the tower and accelerating around the sides. The noise was deafening, a constant, roaring bass note overlaid with the shriek of wind shearing off the steel cables. I reached the ladder. It was a vertical run of 10 feet to the roof deck. The rungs were round steel bars, now coated in ice. I gripped the first rung. The cold bit through my gloves instantly. I pulled myself up. The wind caught my backpack, acting like a sail, trying to peel me off the structure. I pressed my hips into the ladder, minimizing my profile. Left hand, right foot, right hand, left foot. I reached the roof edge. There was no railing here, just a flat expanse of rolled roofing membrane, slick with water and ice, sloping slightly toward the edges to shed rain. I rolled over the parapet and flattened myself against the roof. The wind here was uninterrupted. It roared over the surface, creating a vacuum effect that pulled at my clothes. I crawled on my stomach, swimming across the wet membrane toward the northeast corner. The safety rope trailed behind me, disappearing over the edge to the catwalk below, where it ran under the door jamb to Greer. I reached the corner. The damage was visible even in the dark. The metal flashing, a 10-foot strip of L-shaped galvanized steel, had torn loose from its fasteners. The wind had caught the edge and bent it upward. It was flapping violently, slamming against the roof deck with a rhythmic, metallic crash that I could feel through the roof structure. Slam, slam, slam. Every time it lifted, it scooped rain into the open seam. I had to pin it down. I pulled the drill from my jacket. The grip was cold. I positioned myself over the flapping metal, using my knees to pin it down. The metal fought me, bucking like a live animal as the wind tried to lift it. I grabbed the caulk gun. I jammed the nozzle under the lifted metal and squeezed the trigger. The mastic was cold and thick, resisting the pressure. I squeezed harder, my forearm muscles burning, forcing a bead of black, sticky tar into the gap. Slam. The wind caught the metal again, smearing the tar onto my gloves. "Stay down, damn it," I hissed, the words torn away by the gale. I leaned my full weight onto the flashing, pressing it into the tar. I grabbed a screw from my pocket. It fumbled in my numb fingers, dropping onto the roof and sliding away into the dark. I cursed. I grabbed another. I lined up the drill. The flashing was vibrating.
I pulled the trigger. The drill whined, a high-pitched mechanical complaint. The screw bit into the metal, spun, then caught the wood framing underneath. I drove it home, watching the rubber washer compress until it mushroomed out, sealing the hole. 1 down, 10 to go. I worked down the line, placing a screw every 12 inches. Drill, drive, seal. Drill, drive, seal. My hands were losing dexterity. The rain was running down my sleeves, soaking my thermal layers. I was on the last screw and the tower shuddered. It was not the wind. It was a structural jolt, a deep, resonant twang that vibrated through the entire steel skeleton.
It felt like someone had struck the tower with a giant hammer. I froze, pressing my cheek against the wet roof. I waited. Another jolt. Twang! It was coming from the southeast corner, down below the deck. I finished the last screw, ensuring the flashing was pinned. The leak was stopped. But the tower was speaking to me, and it was saying something was wrong with the tension. I crawled back to the ladder. I did not climb down. I slid, letting the friction of the harness against the rails control my descent. I hit the catwalk and unclipped my tether. I moved to the southeast corner, the source of the vibration. I shined my headlamp into the void. The beam cut through the rain, illuminating the steel trusswork. There. The main guy wire, a 1-inch thick steel cable that anchored the tower to the bedrock, was vibrating violently. The turnbuckle, a massive threaded assembly that controlled the tension, had backed off. The safety wire had snapped or rusted through, and the wind vibration had unscrewed the bolt. The cable was slack, whipping in the wind. Every time a gust hit, the cable snapped tight, sending that shock wave through the tower. If that cable snapped or unthreaded completely, the tower would lose stability on this corner. In this wind, that meant structural torque. The glass would shatter. The frame would twist. I had to tighten it. But the turnbuckle was 10 feet down the leg, suspended over the abyss. I looked at the door. I could go inside, get warm, and hope it held until morning. Twang! The cable whipped again. The sound was sickening, a sound of metal being tortured. It would not hold. I tapped on the glass window near the door. 3 knocks. But instead of signaling entry, I pointed down. Greer's face appeared at the glass, pale and ghost-like. She saw me pointing. She understood. She fed me more slack on the rope. I climbed over the railing. This was the part of the job that usually required a permit, a safety plan, and a rescue team. I had none of those. I had a wet rope and a wife holding the other end inside a glass box. I stepped onto the diagonal cross brace. The steel was wet and slippery. I hung out over the drop, 60 feet of nothing below me. The wind swung me back and forth like a pendulum. I lowered myself down the truss, wrapping my legs around the steel girder. The cold steel sucked the heat out of my inner thighs instantly. I reached the turnbuckle. It was a massive piece of hardware, 18 inches long. The threads were exposed, gleaming wetly in my headlamp beam. I grabbed the central body of the turnbuckle. It was greasy and cold. I tried to turn it by hand. It would not budge. The tension on the line was too erratic. Slack, then tight. Slack, then tight. I needed leverage. I pulled the pry bar from my belt loop. I waited for the lull. The wind gusted. The cable snapped tight, and the turnbuckle locked. Then the wind eased. The cable went slack. Now. I jammed the pry bar through the eye of the turnbuckle body. I heaved on it, pulling down with everything I had. The threads groaned.
a screech of rust breaking. It turned half a rotation. Wait. Wind gust. The cable snapped tight. I held the bar steady, feeling the massive force vibrating through my arms. If I let go, the bar would spin and break my jaw. Wind died. Slack. I pulled again. Another half turn. I needed to get it tight enough that the wind could not whip it. I worked in a rhythm with the storm. Gust. Hold. Lull. Turn. Gust. Hold. Lull. Turn. My arms were screaming. Lactic acid burned in my shoulders. The rain was washing the grease from the threads into my eyes. 10 turns. The cable was stabilizing. The violent whipping had turned into a steady, high-pitched hum. The twang was gone. I gave it one final heave, locking the threads against the stop. I pulled a roll of duct tape from my pocket. I did not have spare safety wire. I wrapped the threads aggressively, taping the turnbuckle body to the bolt. It was not code, but it would stop the vibration from backing it off again tonight. I looked down. The beam of my headlamp hit the ground 60 feet below. The clearing was full of them. The noise of the flashing, slamming, and the cable whipping had drawn them in. There were maybe 20 figures standing in the mud at the base of the tower. They were looking up.
Their faces were pale ovals in the dark, mouths open, rain falling into their throats. They could not climb the sheer steel legs, and the gate was locked, but they were swarming the base. They were bumping into the cross braces, their collective weight pressing against the structure. One of them, a tall figure in a shredded suit, was grabbing the lightning ground wire and pulling on it, mimicking the motion he'd seen me do with the rope. "You're wasting your time," I whispered, my voice lost in the wind. I climbed back up. The ascent was harder than the descent. My muscles were cold and stiff. I hauled myself over the railing and collapsed onto the catwalk grating. I crawled to the door. Knock, knock, knock. The deadbolt snapped back. The door opened. I fell inside. The heat hit me like a physical wall. The smell of wood smoke and chili was overwhelming. Greer grabbed the back of my harness and dragged me clear of the door, slamming it shut and locking it. I lay on the floorboards, water pooling around me. I could not stop shivering. It was not just the cold, it was the adrenaline crash. My teeth chattered with a violence that made my jaw ache. Greer did not ask if I was okay. She knew I was not. She went into triage mode. She stripped the wet gloves off my hands. Her fingers were warm and dry. She unbuckled the harness, pulling the heavy, wet straps off my legs. She pulled my boots off. "Blanket," she commanded, wrapping a heavy wool throw around my shoulders. "Drink this." She handed me a mug of hot water with honey. I tried to hold it, but my hands were shaking too bad. She held it to my lips. The liquid was scalding, but it felt like life itself going down my throat. "The roof?" she asked, her voice calm. "Sealed," I stammered. "Flashing. Pinned." "The noise?" "Turnbuckle. Southeast leg. It backed off. I tightened it." She nodded. She looked at the bucket in the corner. The dripping had stopped. The funnel was still there, but the water had ceased falling. "You stopped it," she said. I closed my eyes, feeling the vibration of the floor. The tower was still moving, swaying in the gale, but the sickening shockwaves were gone. It was moving like a ship now, rhythmic and controlled. "There's a crowd down there," I whispered. "At the base. 20 of them." Greer walked to the window. She kept the shade down, but she listened. Through the floor, we could hear faint thuds, the sound of bodies bumping against the steel legs. "Let them bump," she said.
Steel is harder than bone. She came back to the stove and added a log. The fire flared up, casting long, dancing shadows against the wood walls. I looked at my hands. The knuckles were raw, the skin white and wrinkled from the wet. I had blisters forming where the pry bar had dug in. "We need to sleep," Greer said.
We do shifts. 2 hours on, 2 hours off. Watch the stove, watch the leak. "I'll take the first watch," I said, trying to sit up. "You will not," she said, pushing me back down. "You're hypothermic. You stay in the blankets until you stop shaking. I have the watch." She sat in the armchair by the stove, the shotgun resting across her knees. She looked like a guardian statue carved from granite. I lay there, listening to the storm. The wind was still screaming, trying to find another way in, trying to find another weakness in the armor. But for now, the bolts held. The screws held. The glass held. We were a bubble of heat in a universe of cold entropy. I watched the firelight reflect off Greer's glasses. She was staring at the bucket, watching for the next drop. The crisis was not over. The storm would last for days. The dead were gathering below. The supplies were finite. But the roof was dry. And for tonight, that was the only victory that mattered. Time measures differently when you remove the external markers of civilization. Without the morning commute, the quarterly reports, or the evening news cycle, hours dissolve into a continuous gray fluidity. We stopped tracking the days of the week by name. Tuesday and Saturday feel identical when the primary objective of both is simply to keep the internal temperature above 50 degrees and the caloric intake above 1200. We began measuring time in volts and inches. Volts remaining in the deep cycle battery bank. Inches of water in the filtration reservoir. The storm broke on the 4th morning. It did not end with a dramatic clearing or a burst of sunlight. The sky simply lifted a few hundred feet, transitioning from a suffocating charcoal ceiling to a high, mottled bruising of clouds. The rain throttled back from a deluge to a persistent, misting drizzle, the kind of Pacific Northwest weather that soaks into the grain of the world and stays there. I woke up to the sound of silence. The violent shudder of the tower was gone, replaced by a gentle, oceanic sway. The steel trusswork, warming slightly in the daylight, ticked and groaned as the metal expanded, a thermal conversation between the rivets and the beams. I rolled off the sleeping pad, my joints stiff. The air in the glass cube was cool, but dry. The stove had burned down to a bed of red coals, pulsating faintly behind the mica window. Greer was already up. She sat at the small folding table, the spotting scope angled down through the glass wall. She was not moving. Her stillness was a discipline she had perfected over 20 years of auditing forensic data, the ability to simply exist in a space until the numbers confessed. "Status?" I asked, my voice rough from sleep and wood smoke. "The drift has settled," she said, not looking up from the eyepiece. "They are not leaving." I walked to the window and peered through the gap in the blackout shade. The clearing 60 feet below was a quagmire of mud and debris. The figures, about 24 of them, were no longer swarming the legs of the tower. They had become part of the landscape. Some stood perfectly still, facing the woods. Others moved in slow, eccentric circles, like eddies in a stagnant pool. They were wet, their clothes clinging to their frames like papier-mâché. "They're conserving energy," I said. "They do not have a metabolism to maintain, so they just idle." "It's a siege," Greer corrected. "Passive area denial.
We cannot go down the stairs without clearing the landing zone, and we cannot clear the landing zone without wasting ammunition we cannot replace. She stood up and walked to the kitchen station. Coffee is weak today. I'm rationing the grounds. We're rebrewing the slurry from yesterday with a fresh tablespoon on top. I accepted the mug. The liquid was translucent brown, bitter and acidic. It tasted like survival. I need to check the roof patch, I said, and the solar array. If the clouds are lifting, we might pull some amperage. The routine began. In a confined space, routine is the only thing that prevents the psychological architecture from collapsing. We had developed a strict protocol, a liturgy of maintenance. First, the hygiene check.
In a room 16 by 16 feet, biological waste is a critical engineering challenge. We could not use the woods. We had the chemical bucket, a 5-gallon pail lined with heavy-duty bags and filled with a mixture of sawdust and lime I'd stocked in the shed. I moved the bucket to the designated corner behind the privacy screen. The process was clinical. Do the business, cover with a scoop of sawdust to desiccate and mask the scent, and seal the Gamma Seal lid. The lid spun on with a smooth, threaded resistance, locking the smell inside. It was not dignified, but it was sanitary. When the bag was full, we double-sealed it and staged it on the catwalk, the cold air acting as a freezer. Next, the power systems. I went to the charge controller. The display flickered to life. Input, 14.2 volts. Amperage, 2.1 amps. We're trickling, I announced. It's not enough to run the inverter for the power tools, but it'll top off the lighting battery by sunset if the clouds hold. I grabbed my tool belt and unlocked the door. The air outside was crisp, smelling of ozone and wet cedar. I stepped onto the catwalk, clipping my safety tether to the rail. The fear of falling had diminished, replaced by a respect for the geometry of the drop. I climbed the ladder to the roof. The patch I'd installed during the storm, the mastic and the screws, held fast. The black tar had cured into a rubbery seal. The standing water had drained. I moved to the solar panels. They were coated in a film of pollen and pine needle debris. This debris created shade, and shade on a photovoltaic cell creates resistance, killing the efficiency of the entire string. I used a soft squeegee to clean the glass faces of the panels. As I wiped the grime away, the dark silicon cells caught the diffuse light. I imagined the electrons waking up, flowing down the copper wires, through the roof penetration, and into the lead-acid plates of the battery bank below. It was a silent harvest. Looking down from the roof, the world seemed deceptively peaceful. The endless carpet of evergreens rolled out to the horizon, broken only by the gray ribbon of the river valley. But through the breaks in the trees, I could see the county road. It was empty of cars. No smoke rose from the chimneys of the distant farmhouses. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, like a held breath. I climbed back down to the catwalk. Greer unlocked the door for me. Input is up to 3.5 amps, she reported. Cleaning the panels worked. We need a better water system, I said, unbuckling my harness. Hauling jugs up the hoist is too loud, and it exposes us on the catwalk. If they stay at the base, we can't not risk the noise of the pulley. We have the roof, she said. 400 square feet of catchment. And no way to get it inside without opening a window, I countered. Unless I hard pipe it. This became the project for the day. Survival is 90% boredom and 10% desperate innovation. I went to the supply cache I'd stashed under the bed frame. I had lengths of 1/2-inch PEX tubing, spare fittings, and a few miscellaneous PVC elbows. I looked at the stovepipe penetration. The hole in the roof was cut specifically for the chimney, sealed with a high-temp silicone boot,
But there was a secondary vent, the passive air intake I'd installed near the floor for the stove's combustion air. It ran through the wall, not the roof. I can tap into the gutter downspout on the northeast corner, I explained, sketching the schematic on the back of a soup label. Run a diverter line along the soffit, bring it down the wall, and punch it through the combustion air vent. We put a valve on the inside. When it rains, we open the valve and fill the gravity tank directly. Do we have enough tubing? Greer asked, analyzing the sketch. Barely. I'll have to splice a few scraps together. The work took 4 hours. It was intricate, frustrating work performed with hand tools to avoid the noise of the drill. I worked on the catwalk, cutting the PVC gutter with a hacksaw. The blade bit into the plastic with a rhythmic rasping sound, stripping away white curls of vinyl. I tried to time the cuts with the wind gusts to mask the noise. Below, the figures shifted. One of them looked up when I dropped a pipe clamp.
It hit the grating with a metallic chime. The figure stared at me, its eyes milky and vacant, tracking my movement. It did not growl. It just watched. It was a reminder that we were operating in a fishbowl. I assembled the diverter. I used a T-fitting and a ball valve I scavenged from the garden irrigation supplies in the truck bed days ago. I connected the PEX tubing, using crimp rings to secure the joints. The crimping tool required significant force. I had to squeeze the long handles until the mechanism cycled, compressing the copper ring onto the pipe. I fed the line through the wall vent, packing the gap with steel wool to keep rodents out, then sealing it with silicone. Inside, I rigged the receiving end. The tube terminated over our main 50-gallon storage drum. I installed a final shut-off valve and a sediment filter made from a pair of pantyhose stretched over a funnel, a rough pre-filter to catch the pine needles before the water hit the ceramic purification system. "Test it," I said. There was no rain falling at that moment, so I went back out with a bottle of water and poured it into the gutter section above the diverter. I hurried inside. Greer was watching the clear tube. A moment later, a trickle of water flowed down the PEX, passed through the filter, and splashed into the drum. "It works," she said. "Passive collection. No electricity, no exposure." It was a small victory, but in this environment, a working plumbing modification felt like a moon landing. It meant we were adapting. We were not just camping in a crisis. We were retrofitting our reality. Dinner was rice and a tin of smoked herring. We ate by the light of a single LED lantern, dimmed to its lowest setting to conserve the battery. The smell of the fish was strong, but we did not vent the room. We wanted the heat. Greer pushed her bowl away. "We need to talk about the exit strategy now." I looked at her. The reflection of the red LED made her eyes look dark. "The truck is blocked. The road is washed out. The county is silent." "Exactly," she said. "We are not leaving. Not this week. Maybe not this month." "We have food for 3 weeks if we stretch it," I said. "Water is solved. Heat is wood dependent, and we have the forest." "The forest is down there," she pointed to the floor. "With them." "I can rig a distraction," I said. "Draw them off. Lead them down the logging road." "And if more come?" she asked. "The noise carries. Every time we engage, we roll the dice. I've been running the numbers on the consumption rates versus the risk of acquisition. The math says we stay put. We go into stasis." Stasis. A suspended state. A pause in the biological imperative to move and expand. "We need to fortify the mind," she continued. If we sit here staring at them, staring at us, we'll go crazy. We need a schedule that has nothing to do with survival. Like what? Knitting? Education, she said. We have the manuals. You teach me the structural engineering. I teach you forensic accounting. We read the books we brought. We keep the brain elastic. She was right. The lethargy was already setting in, the desire to just sit by the stove and stare at the fire. It was a dangerous seduction. Okay, I said. Lesson 1. Load paths and shear walls. Tomorrow, she said. Tonight, we scan. We turned on the shortwave radio. I had a portable Texun unit, a small black brick of electronics. I extended the whip antenna. The static was a white noise ocean. Shh. I turned the dial slowly, moving through the bands. AM, FM, shortwave. Nothing but the cosmic background radiation and the interference of the atmosphere. Occasionally a ghost of a voice, a skip from a distant station, maybe China, maybe Russia, bouncing off the ionosphere, would drift in and fade before it could be resolved. Then, on 4.625 megahertz, we heard it. It was not a voice. It was a mechanical rhythm. A buzzer. Buzz, pause. Buzz, pause. The buzzer, I whispered. UVB 76, the Russian station. It's still transmitting. It's automated, Greer said. It does not mean anyone is home. It just means the generator has not run out of fuel yet. We listened to the monotonous drone for 10 minutes. It was hypnotic. A dead man's switch broadcasting to a dead world. It was strangely comforting. It meant that somewhere, a machine was still doing its job, still following its programming, indifferent to the collapse. Turn it off, Greer said. Save the batteries. I clicked the dial. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. Night fell completely. The tower became a floating island in a void. We could not see the ground, but we could hear it. The wind had died down, and the sounds of the forest floor drifted up. The snap of a twig, the wet shuffle of footsteps in the mud, the occasional low, fluid cough of one of the things waiting below. I took the first watch. Greer curled up on the mattress, wrapped in the wool blanket. Her breathing evened out quickly. She was efficient even in sleep. I sat in the chair, the shotgun across my lap. I did not look out the window. There was nothing to see. Instead, I looked at the interior of our world. The PEX tubing running along the wall, the stack of firewood meticulously arranged by size, the condensation catching the red light of the lantern, the tension rods of the roof truss crossing in an X above my head. I realized then that we had not just built a getaway. We had built a capsule. We were astronauts, stranded on a hostile planet, separated from the toxic atmosphere by a quarter-inch of tempered glass and a layer of silicone sealant. I picked up the legal pad where we tracked our inventory. I turned to a fresh page. Project list. 1. Hard pipe rain collection, complete. 2. Reinforce hatch locking mechanism. 3. Fabricate noise suppressor for generator. 4. Map the migration patterns of the subjects below. I clicked the pen. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. I wrote one more line at the bottom. 5. Accept that this is home. I set the pad down. I checked the stove. The fire was banking perfectly, a steady, low-consumption burn that would last until 4:11. I leaned back and closed my eyes. I did not dream of rescue. I dreamed of torque wrenches, of perfect welds, of steel that did not rust and glass that did not break. I dreamed of systems that worked, even when the world did not. Below me, in the dark, the dead shifted their weight and waited.
Above them, suspended in the iron web of the tower, we waded back. The anchor held.